The iron scent of fresh gore and the sulfuric stench of the tide are a mixture I will never be able to scrub from beneath my fingernails. I am Lieutenant Evelyn Vance, and 10 minutes ago, I pronounced a soldier dead after watching his pupils fix and his chest collapse into a ruin of wet wool and shattered bone. I tagged him black and moved to the next litter. But as I sit here in the mud to record his time of death, he is sitting on a crate behind me, asking the orderly for a light with the very lungs I saw shredded by shrapnel. My primary problem is not the German counterattack. It is the fact that the dead on Omaha Beach have stopped following the rules of medicine. June 6, 1944. 2100 hours. My name is Lieutenant Evelyn Vance, and my world has narrowed to the size of a blood-stained canvas, tent pitched 300 yards from the high tide mark of Omaha Beach. The primary problem is the salt water. It is a persistent, invisible enemy that dissolves the adhesive on the medical triage tags before the ink can even dry. We are working in a slurry of mud and sea foam, the air thick with the suffocating smell of diesel fumes, wet wool, and the unmistakable iron tang of open wounds. My task is the sorting, a brutal arithmetic of survival. I have processed 42 men in the last 4 hours, moving between the litters with a pair of heavy shears and a roll of gauze that is already turning gray from the damp. I must decide who can wait, who goes to the surgeons, and who stays in the dark row near the back of the tent where the lanterns do not reach. I successfully cleared the first wave of litter cases, marking each man with a stamp and a professional detachment that is the only thing keeping me upright. I sat down at a supply crate to update the triage log, my fingers so stiff from the cold spray that I had to crack my knuckles twice just to hold the pencil. But as I scanned the room to confirm the count, I found a man sitting on a crate in the far corner wearing a black tag I signed 10 minutes ago. I remember his face clearly. I remember the way his chest had stopped moving and the way his eyes had fixed on the tent ceiling. The tag tied to his buttonhole clearly states he was pronounced dead of a tension pneumothorax at 20:05 hours. Yet he is currently leaning forward, asking the orderly for a light for his cigarette, his chest rising and falling with a steady, effortless rhythm. I approached him to check the entry wound I had documented in his left side, but when I peeled back his blood-soaked tunic, the skin was unbroken, pale, and as warm as a living man in the heat of midsummer. June 7th. 0300 hours. The rain has turned the floor of the tent into a thick, black soup of mud and iodine that reaches my ankles. We have run out of sulfa powder, and the morphine supply has dwindled to exactly 12 syrettes. I made the decision to stop using anesthesia for minor debridement and shrapnel removal, saving the remaining ether for the abdominal cases that come in screaming. The sound of the bone saw through the canvas is a wet, rhythmic rasp that never seems to stop, even when the artillery falls silent. I noticed a massive discrepancy in the morning report while checking the inventory of the dead. Every man I tagged as black, the 22 soldiers we moved to the holding trench outside because they were beyond saving, is now listed as having been discharged to the rear. I did not sign those discharge papers, and there are no trucks available for transport. I walked out into the rain with a shielded lantern to check the trench myself, expecting to find the bodies waiting for the graves registration units. The trench is empty. There are no bodies, only deep, heavy impressions in the mud where the men had been lying. The orderly, Private Miller, was standing by the wire and told me he saw them get up one by one. He said they didn't speak or look at him. They simply adjusted their helmets, picked up their rifles from the mud, and walked back toward the cliffs in perfect, silent formation. I checked the mud for footprints leading away from the trench, but there were none, only the smooth, undisturbed surface of the rising tide. June 7th. 1200 hours. The German 88mm guns are zeroing in on the beachhead, and the vibrations are so violent that the surgical lamps are swinging like pendulums, casting long, erratic shadows across the patients. I have been awake for 36 hours, and my fingers are so swollen from the damp and the salt that I can no longer tie a surgical knot without my vision blurring. I made a grave mistake during the last rush of casualties from the draw. I administered a double dose of morphine to a boy from the 29th Infantry because the mud on his face made him look like a man I had treated an hour before. He stopped breathing while I was looking into his eyes, his pulse vanishing beneath my thumb like a guttering candle. I went to record the time of death in the logbook to document the error, but the page was already open to his name and service number. The entry was already completed in a hand that looks exactly like mine, but the ink is a deep, bruised shade of purple that we do not carry in our medical kits. The log states he died of a respiratory arrest at 12:10 hours. I looked at the watch pinned to my lapel. It was exactly 12:10. I looked back at the boy on the litter, and his dog tags had changed. They no longer belonged to a soldier. They were my own tags, stamped with my name and my blood type, cold and heavy against his motionless chest. June 8th. 0200 hours. The tent is sagging under the weight of the rainwater, and we are surrounded by a sea of rising mud that smells of old smoke. A runner arrived from the beach with news that the evacuation ships have been delayed by the storm, and the perimeter is shrinking. We are alone with 80 wounded men and no rations. I have started using my own cotton undershirts as bandages, tearing them into strips with my teeth because my shears have become too dull to cut fabric. A man was brought in on a litter with his face entirely obscured by a heavy, rubberized gas mask. He had no unit patch, no helmet, and no dog tags. When I reached out to check his carotid pulse, he grabbed my wrist with a mechanical strength that bruised the bone. He told me through the diaphragm of the mask that I had forgotten to count the girl. I told him there are no girls in this sector of Normandy and that he was delirious from blood loss. He didn't answer, but pointed a mud-caked finger to the dark corner of the tent where we keep the pile of amputated boots and uniforms. There is a small pair of leather shoes sitting in the mud. They're perfectly clean, polished to a high shine, and they are the only dry thing in the entire province of France. 0500 hours. The German counterattack has pushed within 200 yards of our position, and the staccato rhythm of MG-42 machine guns is shredding the apple orchard directly behind the medical tent. I went to the supply cabinet to find the last of the medicinal alcohol to clean my hands, but when I opened the metal doors, the shelves were empty of medicine. Instead, the cabinet was filled with small, brown paper envelopes labeled personal effects. I pulled one out. It was labeled with my own name, Lieutenant Evelyn Vance, and the date June 6, 1944. Inside the envelope was the silver watch my father gave me, the one currently pinned to my lapel, and a fountain pen that is still in my pocket. I looked at the man in the gas mask, his breathing heavy and mechanical behind the rubber filter. He pointed to the triage log on the table. The ink was moving across the paper without a pen to guide it, filling in the disposition column for every man in the tent. It didn't mark them as wounded or killed. It marked them as non-existent. I looked at my own hands, and for a second, they were translucent, the bones visible beneath the skin like shadows in a fog. The man in the mask spoke again, his voice a low vibration that seemed to come from the floorboards. He told me that the manifest must be balanced, and that for every man who walked out of the trench, a name must be erased from the world. I looked at the logbook, and my own name was being slowly crossed out with a single, thick line of purple ink. The journal of Lieutenant Evelyn Vance was recovered in the summer of 1958 during the demolition of a reinforced German bunker near Vierville-sur-Mer. The book was found inside a sealed, airtight medical chest that had been buried under 6 feet of poured concrete and debris. Official Army records state that Lieutenant Vance was killed at 0630 on the morning of June 6, 1944, when her landing craft was destroyed by an 88mm shell before it reached the shoreline. She never set foot on France. However, the journal contains precise, technical descriptions of surgical wounds and conditions that were not documented by the medical corps until the final weeks of the war in 1945. The handwriting has been verified as an exact match by 3 separate military graphologists. The final entry in the book is not a diary note, but a formal requisition for 22 sets of dog tags, all belonging to men who were confirmed to have survived the war and returned to the United States. The journal is currently held in a secure climate-controlled vault at a military research facility. The curators report that the physical weight of the book increases by exactly 1 ounce every year on the anniversary of the landings, and that the ink on the final page remains wet to the touch, 80 years after it was supposedly written. No explanation has ever been found for why the silver watch found inside the chest was still ticking, despite having no internal gears or springs.